And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Michuta.
Welcome, everybody, to Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo. The reason I'm laughing is I wish you could see what happens before showtime. Just sheer panic. All of a sudden, the Skype connections wants to reinstall stuff, and literally right at the tick, we go live. And it's working. So thanks be to God. So thanks, Richard. Sorry for the panic moment. I can't control my computer. It has a mind of its own. Anyway, welcome everybody to the program. And today's a very special program because I'm not going to be the host. The host is going to be our good friend, William Albrecht, who runs Patristic Pillars. He also has a fantastic channel on YouTube. Just William Albrecht is the title, and he's also the author of several great books. And today's the big day because today Revolt Against Reality has been released by Catholic Answers Press. I'm so excited. So I thought, actually, this was William's idea that he could come on the show and he could interview me about the book. And so how you doing, William? Welcome to the show.
Gary, I'm doing very well. Thrilled that we were able to connect, and I have to share it with the audience as well. It seems to happen very often, not only during shows like this, but pretty much behind the scenes. I don't think people realize sometimes Skype or any of these other programs, they want to begin to reinstall or install an update right when it's showtime, almost all the time, brother.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's just, that's just par for the course, or who knows? Maybe it's spiritual warfare. Who knows?
It could be.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, the weird thing about this book, William, is usually once I send the manuscript to the printer, it's like all the spiritual warfare ends. But for this book, it has been going on and on and on. So who knows? God willing, that's the last of any kind of spiritual pushback. But anyway, I am thrilled to have you on the show and have you in the sensei seat there. And put me in the hot seat. And I have to say, the funny thing is, you have your review copy of the book. I have yet to get a copy of it, so I can't even hold my book up to show the audience.
Well, I'll tell you one thing, Gary. When the last two books that we put out, you got copies before we did as well. That usually happens. But I want the audience. Hopefully, it does come out. It is a beautiful cover, beautiful looking book. Congratulations on it. And I have to tell you, Gary, what a great read. Everybody out there, from what I have looked at, because I've had people reach out to me and say, William, I can't find the book on Amazon. You're going to want to go to catholicanswers.com, catholic.com, I believe, right?
Shop.catholic.com. Yep.
My bad. Shop.catholic.com. You will find it there. It is in stock, and they have it for a fantastic price right now. Great read. And Gary, I can tell why spiritual warfare does go on, because this is a very much needed book, very, very good book, particularly for the times that we're living in. For people wondering, Revolt Against Reality is the title of the book, and we'll get that. It'll appear. It appeared a little while ago. We'll get it to appear again in a little bit. Great book, Gary. But I want to ask you, before we dig in, and we're going to dig in real quickly, if you can tell me, what inspired the book?
Oh, it's just because the world be crazy, William. That's what inspired it. Things have been getting insane. When I wrote the book, this was a couple of years ago. Yeah. Things were nuts. And so I thought it'd be great to be able to look into the roots of how we got to where we are. And so there were some really great major works. In fact, I did a show about this, I think, last week. Major books that were huge puzzle pieces that explain parts of why things are the way they are. But unfortunately, they were very pedantic, very academic, so they're only the kind of books like you or I would read,
Yeah.
no one else. And I thought, you know what, somebody needs to put these pieces together and just stitch it as a narrative so that you can see the big picture of where we started and where we're headed. And so that's when I thought, okay, I got to do a book. And I have to say, when I finished it, and actually the engineer, Richard, helped me with the proofreading. So kudos to you, Richard. I realized, you know what, this book really ends dark. You know, the last chapter, it was pretty bleak. And I thought, you know what, I need to finish at least on a good note, because people are going to say, where do we go from here? And so I added a chapter called Reality Strikes Back, where I started looking at how, you can't deny reality very long without it affecting things. And so I just, searched, looked around, tried to find some bright glimmers of hope, for that things aren't going to stay the way they are. And, I have to say, William, I'm really pleased because that was a couple of years ago. And I have to say, a lot of the things that you find happening in the news is kind of expanding and fulfilling some of the things I have in that last chapter. So that tells me, it has predictive power, and I think it also has explanatory power. So hopefully I hit the target.
I truly believe you did, and I think this is a book that everybody has got to have. They've got to own it, got to have it on their bookshelves. But before we get to that particular part of your book, let's get to the beginning. You have incredible, the way the book is divided up. I've got to tell you, Gary, when I opened up the book, and I remember opening it up and saying, okay, well, what does Gary have here? And I was captivated by every section of your book. And you know me, Gary, we'll get to a particular part where I particularly loved the Christological revolt, but we'll get to that later. In the beginning, you dig into the creation and the incarnation. Magnificent the way, and I appreciate the fact that you give much beautiful dedication to the Deuterocanon. A lot of books don't do that, but of course, coming from you, I know that you're always going to give wonderful attention to the Deuterocanon. What do we have here in that particular section of your book, the creation and the incarnation? What do you break down for us there, Gary?
Yeah, well, I mean, I start at the very beginning, because you can't understand the incarnation and its importance unless you understand creation and you understand how God creates. And of course, God is the real. He is existence himself. And so when he creates reality, it's a reflection of his own wisdom. He creates it through his word. And 1 Corinthians says that, Christ is the wisdom of God and the power of God. Everything is created through his word. So reality itself is linked in some, in a corresponding way to God himself. Yeah. And so I get into some particulars. God's wisdom is manifested in creation because he makes things according to their kind. Okay, so it's not just, not only shows his wisdom, but there's an order within the order of creation. And there's a particular way he creates. And I go into that in the book. And so that's like embedded in reality. You can't deny that. So moving on, the next chapter is the first revolt with Adam and Eve. And that's really the first act of insanity. If sanity is the correspondence between what we know and how things truly are, sin is like an act of insanity because you believe things that they aren't how they really are. And so I show how Adam and Eve, through the serpent's lie, and I dive into the serpent's lie, actually pre-shadows a lot of what later becomes some major, major heresies, and ultimately undermines our ability to understand reality. We kind of enter into a fantasy world. And he opens up the possibility of divine deception. If you read the lie, the serpent's saying, God's kind of not telling you the full story. He's holding out on you. He really isn't good. He gave you this law to hold you back. And if you eat the fruit, you'll be like him. You can determine for yourself what is good and evil, because, God by his nature creates good, and by contrast evil. But you'll be like God. You could use your will to determine what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's evil. And, of course, they buy the lie and they plunge into darkness. And then in my book, I show how God slowly reintroduces sanity into the world. And actually, William, I think you would like that chapter for a couple of reasons. First, because, it answers a lot of atheistic stuff about, why would God permit slavery? Why would God, give eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, Yeah,
no doubt, Gary.
Yeah.
I appreciated how the book was masterful, and you point out how in the New Testament, we are no longer slaves to sin under the new covenant, under Christ. Indeed, we're called brother. We're part of the family of God. And this is a major difference, as you know very well, Gary, because you have done incredible work in various different religions and cults and what have you. And various cults do try to keep us under that bondage of slavery, but we are not slaves under the new covenant. That was a beautiful thing you pointed out, just masterful. And I know we're about to go to a break, so we will definitely dig in more once we do return. I think we have a few seconds, if I'm correct, right?
Yeah. In fact, and that chapter ends too, William, with, I hear the music. You're actually better at this than I am. Boy, I was hoping to sneak in some more. All right. Well, hey, thank you. That's a great tip. Now we're going to go to a commercial break. You're listening to Hands On Apologetics. Stay tuned.
If you shop on Amazon.com, there's an easy way to support Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Just visit smile.amazon.com and type in Catholic Resource Center under the desired charity. Now, when you log into your Amazon account and purchase products, a portion of it will automatically go to support Virgin Most Powerful Radio at no cost to you. Thanks in advance for supporting CRC and VMPR, and may God richly bless you and your family.
Did you know my mom's gonna have a baby?
She is? Will it be a boy? Or will it be a girl?
We don't know yet, but we heard the heartbeat, and my dad said this is gonna be someone very special.
You mean like being a president? Or maybe a doctor?
Well, probably maybe like a singer or dancer, I think.
Hello, my name is Marianne Koharski. I'm the director of Pro-Life Across America. We know that every baby is a miracle and has the potential to do great things. If you know someone who is pregnant or in need of alternatives or assistance, or would like to support the work of Pro-Life Across America, please call 1-800-366-7773 or visit our website at prolifeacrossamerica.org. Pro-Life Across America is non-political and totally educational.
Pro-Life Across America.
This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for your support here at Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Here's an easy way to do it. If you're going to sell or buy a house, call Real Estate for Life, 877-543-3871, because they're going to get you a Christ-centered agent to purchase your home or to sell your home. And at the close of escrow, a portion of his commission goes right back to Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Call 877-543-3871. Thank you so much for your support.
Now, back to Hands On Apologetics with Gary Michuta. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's
Gary. That left off with a great cliffhanger, and we're back. And for people wondering, I am in the seat today interviewing Gary. We're talking about his incredible book, new book, barely came out, Revolt Against Reality. So I know my green screen is kind of blanking. There we go. But earlier in the show, you got a clear view of that. It is out now. Shop.catholic.com. You can find it out today. Gary, you were making an incredible point, and the break really did sneak up upon us.
Yeah, I told my listeners, when I was hyping the show, that watch how many times I try to be the host instead of the guest. So anyway, actually, Will, and this is something I know this is near and dear to your heart too. Right before the time of Christ, you have Alexander the Great, who institutes, actually those who follow him, institutes this forced Hellenization, throughout the known world. And so Hebrew revelation comes in contact with Greek philosophy, Greek reason. So you have faith and reason. And at that point, something amazing happens because through the deuterocanonical books, especially Wisdom and Sirach, you see how the entrance of this, certain elements of Greek thought, Greek philosophy, actually elevates and clarifies revelation so that you start having ideas about, well, God's wisdom is somehow personified and has divine attributes and things like that. So that's really important in the big story, because when we see later in Islam, when Islamic revelation meets Aristotle, it's a train wreck, know? Yeah.
Yeah, it truly is, Gary, and that is a great point that you bring up. And I noticed the incredible references to wisdom, and the fact that the early church frequently hearkened to wisdom, it really does tell us a whole lot. You even include, if I'm correct, Sirach. I'm trying to remember where I will remember in a little bit, but you include a number of incredible references to the Bible. And, one area that I do want to really look at, you also cover an area titled Christological Heresies and Their Consequences. It pretty much deals with the Christological revolt. And I really, really like that particular area there. Can you maybe tell us what did you view as pretty much the heart of the issue there? Was it the fact that in these Christological heresies that the Christ of the Bible and of the early church was kind of distorted? Or what do we find here in this particular section?
Yeah, well, the incarnation is like this atomic bomb of reality that was exploded in the ancient world. It's this giant unifying factor of heaven and earth, material and spiritual, divine, human. It unites all of us to God himself, and through the incarnation, it unites each of us together as parts of his body. So it's this it's an explosion that sets off many subsequent explosions, revolutions of thought, which eventually become Western civilization. Yeah. And then there's a counterattack, and that's what you're talking about, where the bright light of what occurred in the incarnation was denied or what do I want to say, diminished.
Yeah, there we go.
Heretics. So both sides of the incarnation, for example, on the human side, there were attempts to deny Christ's true divinity. With the Docetists, they said it was only the appearance of a physical body. He didn't actually have a physical body. And, of course, Gnosticism likewise denied that Jesus came in the flesh, because in their view, all material things were evil and only spiritual things were good. So God taking on human nature was absurd to them. And also even the heresy of monothelism, the denial that Christ has a true human will. Yeah. That's also a denial of Christ's true humanity. So there's an attack on the human side. There's also attack on the divine side. For Arianism, for example, taught that the Word was something that the Father created out of nothing in time. So there was a time when God didn't have the Son, the Father didn't have a Son. And all of these things have major ramifications as to our relationship with God and God's relationship to creation. And
Gary, I apologize. I was merely going to point out that you're definitely on point there. And the one thing I really liked about the book, and not many books do it, but you provide an incredible breakdown. Like, you break down and you show the audience a timeline. Like, you've got the great Saint Irenaeus of Lyon. You follow it up by dates of various other Christological heresies. And the incredible thing that you bring out in your book, Gary, is, as you point out, we focus a lot on the heresies and the darkness within heresy. But you focus on the great champions of the faith as well. You've got Irenaeus here, the great St. Athanasius of Alexandria. So we're looking at the beautiful champions of the faith that have been brought up, risen up by the glory and grace of our Lord and Savior. So there's a lot of really incredible material to be found here. And I want to let the audience know one thing. You know, Gary, I think that the toughest part of writing a book is writing a book to where not only are you going to fulfill the nerd in you, as you know, you and me, we love to nerd out, but to also write a book that is very readable. And I think you have struck that fine balance here, because the person in me that loves really theological meaty information was satiated with this book. And as well as I was able to notice as well that it's a very readable book. A lot of people out there, even if you're barely beginning and digging in, you're going to get a lot out of it. And even people that are very well read on these particular issues are going to get a lot out of it. And I think you really hit it perfectly with that, Gary. And, you know, I've got to really congratulate you there. You really brought out a lot of things that are very important throughout Christian salvation history. And, you know, one particular area that I also appreciate you included in the timeline is an area where we need to get better catechized in today. And you point out that a Christological heresy as well as can be found within Islam. A lot of people don't realize that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was trying to follow the thread, you know, from the serpent. He basically says that God acts outside. I mean, God is good, but you know what? God does some things through his will that can be, you know, wrong. It can hold back humanity. He really doesn't love you, you know. So the secret knowledge kind of reveals that God's will is somehow separated from who he is, you know, goodness itself. And then you have the Gnostics, the same thing, where they have secret knowledge about, you know, what God really is. And the only way you can know his will is through this secret knowledge that's given by these experts, the knowing ones, right? Yeah. And then when you get to Islam, Islam actually rejects both Christ's humanity and divinity. And I think a lot of people don't know that. For example, there is an Islamic belief that Jesus wasn't crucified, that God actually had somebody, you know, some sort of impersonator, you know, yep. So that the Jews and even the Christian followers of Jesus thought Jesus was crucified, but actually Jesus was secretly taken up to heaven and somebody else died in his place. And so you have divine deception, you know, even in Islamic thought, in Islamic revelation. But the divinity, of course, is denied. They say that Allah has no son. Yeah. And the reason they do that's because they have a very materialistic understanding of generation or begetting. You know, they say he doesn't have a son because he didn't have a wife to have a son.
Yeah.
You know, so they're thinking.
Great point there. Yeah, you're right. They unfortunately interpret where we find only begotten or begotten in the Bible, they interpret it in a very erroneous manner, a manner in which none of the early fathers would have interpreted. Very, very good points there, Gary. I do want to be able to, you know, try and cover as much as I can, but I want the audience to know, go over to shop.catholic.com, get your hands on Revolt Against Reality. It is out now, today. And I got to tell Gary, when I got my copy of the mail, I was thrilled. I'd been waiting for this book to come out. And I'm a little bit geeking out, and I'm a little bit poking fun at Gary because Gary doesn't have his copy yet. If you get your copy today, you might get yours in the mail before Gary. So, head out, get a copy. This is an incredible book. Another particular area that I really, really appreciate, Gary, and I appreciate it because not a whole lot of books deal with it. It is under your Ecclesiastical Revolt section. And I know that it will definitely, a lot of ears are going to be, perking up there. What do you deal with there, and why is this such an essential part of your work here in this book?
Yeah, well, actually, William, let me just take a step back, and then you'll understand why I'm looking at Protestantism like I do. When Greek philosophy encounters Islamic revelation, it's incompatible, because there are certain things that are revealed in the Quran that just simply doesn't square with, philosophical thought. And so two parties develop. One is that we should use reason to understand Quranic revelation, and then the other party is use Quranic revelation alone. And the reason for that is they conceive that God, or Allah, his will is disconnected from his nature. So Allah can will anything he wants, and everything's under compulsion to do what he wants. So in a way, in Islam, you have kind of a sola Quran, The only way you can understand, if God's will is arbitrary, and he can even change his will. In fact, he could change revelation. He can abrogate verses. You really don't know what the will of Allah is except by the book alone, and you can through clerics, through experts on, what is Allah's will in this regard. Now, what happens is in Europe, there is a fight in Germany, okay? So this is up your alley. With Ludwig of Bavaria and John, I think it's the 22nd. And Ludwig there was problems with his election as the Holy Roman Empire. So the Pope basically tells him to stand down. He won't. There's a war that ensues, and he chooses as one of his intellectual weapons William of Ockham. Okay. William of Ockham actually has a conception very close to and probably comes from Islamic thought, namely that God can will anything apart from his nature. He's not constrained by his nature. So, Ockham would say God could have crucified a donkey instead of Jesus, and it would still suffice to be a universal sacrifice for sin. And that thought goes into the school system of nominalism and ultimately Martin Luther.
Great cliffhanger. We'll be back right after the break.
This is a catechetical minute from Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
Just as the gestation of our first birth took place in water, so the water of baptism truly signifies that our birth in the divine life is given to us in the Holy Spirit. Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 694. The most basic elements of human life are often the actual tools that God uses in our relationship with Him. Water is one such element God has used, from the flood, to the Red Sea, to the Jordan River. Father, you have made all things with this in mind. May we recognize these signs of your love in creation.
This has been a catechetical minute from Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Michuta on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And we are back.
Everybody.
Oh, my bad there.
I did it. I predicted I would do it. Go ahead, William. I'm sorry.
You sure did, Gary. No, I wanted to welcome everybody back and tell them today we're talking about Gary's incredible book. It just came out, Revolt Against Reality. We've got it right there. What a beautiful, beautiful cover. You got to get your copy, shop.catholic.com right now. And I've been teasing Gary throughout the show because he hasn't gotten his author copy yet. What happens is usually the authors, they remember us at the very end. So the author copies arrive a little later. You can get your copy now if you go over there. And we've been talking about the incredible book. And Gary, you were talking about nominalism right before the break crept up upon us. And I'd like to, go right back there because it really does, in my opinion, a lot of it really does connect to everything we've been talking about thus far.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, nominalism denies universals. So groups of things like treeness or triangularity, they say it doesn't exist. It's like a figment of your imagination. The only thing that really exists is discrete individuals. Okay, so nominalism likes to break things down into individuals. It tries to ignore groups. And in regards to God, William of Ockham said that God basically, he can will something that doesn't have to correspond to how things truly are. God, all that matters is what God says, or the name. That's where the name nominalism comes from. It's the name that's important. So God could call something evil in the Old Testament. He could call it good in the New, or he could do vice versa. It doesn't matter what the thing is. So, like murder could be called good, or helping the poor could be called evil. It all depends on God's will and what he calls it. And that sets up Martin Luther. Martin Luther comes and he has this nominalistic worldview, and he applies it to Catholic theology. And that's where he comes up, William, with this idea that justification is by faith alone, and most importantly, that it's through imputation alone, by a legal decree of God. That's how we're made righteous, is that God calls us righteous, even though we're sinners and worthy of damnation at the same time. So according to God's view, we're ready for heaven. We are sinless, but in reality, what we truly are still damnable, sinful people. And Martin Luther's, by disconnecting, in a sense, God's will from his nature and his decree from reality, what happens is that unity that you saw that came together with the incarnation gets pulled apart into all these different bifurcations. Now, so Luther, it's either, he puts faith against works. He puts grace against human will. He puts law against grace. He divides all those things that were a unity in the incarnation is now divided. And that includes even governments. He came up with an idea of the two kingdoms where, there's the kingdom of the church, the kingdom of God, and then there's the kingdom of man. Where before, the state and the church were two distinct things, but they were interlocked together. But Luther, he kind of is the first to kind of tear those two apart and make a religious sphere versus a secular sphere.
Great points you bring up there as well, Gary. And as we realize, a number of problems really arise from the positions that Martin Luther does take. And in particular, I really appreciated how you bring out the major issue of imputed righteousness, because that is definitely, the thing that I like to point out very often is what a bit of irony that we've got in Martin Luther, an Augustinian monk, who really betrayed the massive majority of the great St. Augustine's teaching. Because St. Augustine affirmed he would not have taught imputed righteousness. He did indeed affirm the clear teaching of the Bible that nothing impure can enter heaven. As the book of Revelation, chapter 21, clearly tells us, we must be pure. We must be pure and holy. Thus, the need for ongoing justification, sanctification, and if need be, a purification in the afterlife. But great points you bring up there, Gary. And I think, it goes, as you point out in the book, it goes beyond only Luther. You find these issues and problems in the great reformers, if you will. Figures that would be called pillars of the Reformation. You find it in Zwingli. And you find, in my opinion, I don't know if you would take this particular position, but I think by the time we get to Calvin, you've got a kind of a really, really, it's I don't want to use an ugly term. It's, devolving. It's getting, things are getting worse within the Protestant sphere of things. Do you kind of view it like that? That things are kind of, they're getting worse.
Yeah, it's, history has a way of beating, logic to its final end. And so if you make a small mistake at the beginning, future generations will ultimately take it to its end, no matter how insane it is. And that's why in my book, Revolt Against Reality is, we're at the back end of what was a fundamental error that occurred, way back, with the Gnostics, with Islam, Nominalist and Lutheran Protestantism. And so what happens is, beginning with Zwingli, because God is separated from his creation in this way, and also his will is separated from his nature, what happens is you start losing that sacramental view of the world. And so Zwingli starts trying to make Christian worship more spiritual, less physical, right? And especially with Calvin, he institutes a program to kind of eradicate the physicalness of Christian worship and just Christian life. He eradicates the liturgical calendar, right? He thought it was superstitious. And I have a quote from a sermon he gives where he castigates his congregation for going to church, on Christmas. He also denies the idea of sacred space. He thinks that the material world is like an obstacle for us to have communion with God, rather than, the incarnation. It's actually Christ's humanity. It's the physical world through which God acts with us. So it's almost the inverse of the incarnation with Calvin. And for me, I'm in my book, as I'm tracing this line of thought, what you find in Calvinism, of course, is this idea of election, which becomes very important. How do you know you're elect? Because according to Calvin, God predestines some to heaven, and he also predestines some to hell. So how do you know whether you've been sovereignly predestined to hell or heaven? And you don't have a choice in it. There's no free will. So Calvin said, well, you know this through celebrating the listening to the word and sacrament given in a correct fashion. That's an indicator of election. But what happens is, as Calvinism spreads outside of Geneva, and especially in England, where they can't participate in the word and sacrament rightly celebrated, right? The question of how do you know whether you're elect slowly starts becoming introspective, William. So the English Puritans start looking for interior signs of election, not exterior things like proper sacraments, church membership, things like that. And so you can see how, as you trace the path of Protestantism, how it slowly begins to retreat from reality and into a kind of spiritual interior aspect of the Christian life.
And I really enjoyed how you pointed out how really the abandonment of the heart of the sacraments, the abandonment of the liturgy, which is very biblical. The Bible is very clear. really does lead to really this incredible and unfortunate revolt. And I think the title of your book is very, very appropriate for the material that you do deal with. And every particular section of your book is just really filled with information, Gary. And another particular area that I do want to dive into, what I found it very, very fulfilling was, and you find it, section 4, and people can get a little bit of a preview right there. It's called Epistemological Revolt. And you have what I think is so fascinating are the titles of your particular sections. They pull you in. They pull you in, Gary. You're great at doing that. But not only the titles that you've got there, Gary, but the material you have, so incredible. One particular area, you begin by titling it Inventing Religion. Now, what do we find under this particular part in your book?
Yeah, well, what happens also, and this is true for Gnosticism, it's true for, anything that this kind of nominalist idea of, that we can't know God's will. It's not that God doesn't will in accord with his nature is fractions. Because for Martin Luther, Protestant identity was he's the righteous rebel. Here I stand, I can do no other, despite the fact that actually probably was never said. And also the drive for doctrinal purity. That was his reason for breaking off with Rome, was that he needed to purify doctrine. And those two facets of righteous rebel and doctrinal purity just shatters the Lutheran movement into myriads of competing sects and groups and denominations. And eventually, William, as you know, religious wars ensue. Because at this time, church and state was very closely united. So when this comes on the scene, there's religious wars. And what happens is people begin to search for some way to unify humanity apart from Christ and the revelation. Christ and the incarnation. Yeah. And so that's when religion is invented. And I could see at the time we're coming up close. So maybe on the other side of the break, we can explore that a little more.
There you go. It has finally come up here for me. Definitely. Very, very good cliffhanger. You're not going to want to tune out. Stay in right on here. We're going to pick that up. We're going to deal more with this on the other side of the break.
Welcome, Daniel. You're on the line. What's on your mind, brother?
Hi, I just wanted to share a testimony about Virgin Most Powerful Radio. I had a buddy at work who, he's a lukewarm Catholic guy, and I wanted him to start listening to the Terry and Jesse show, so I kept telling him to download the app, and he kept putting me off. So one day, I grabbed his phone and I downloaded the app for him. I went on vacation, and I kept telling him to listen to it. He was kind of put me off. I came back from vacation. He comes to my cubicle, and he says to me, "Hey, man, I've been listening to Terry and Jesse's show, and it's great." And it's made a big impact in his life. The guy, he's going to weekly adoration a couple times a week. He goes to the Mass in the morning. Mm-hmm. He's an on-fire Catholic, and he promotes the Terry and Jesse show in the Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
Daniel, what a testimony. And I want to encourage our listeners to get those cards by going to virginmostpowerfulradio.org and do what Daniel's doing. Go out and spread the faith by inviting people to listen to Virgin Most Powerful. Daniel, thanks for your testimony, brother. God love you.
You're welcome.
Here's a great way to support Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Do you have an old car you want to get rid of, motorcycle, RV, or boat? Simply call 855-500-7433, and when they sell that vehicle, a portion of that money comes right back to support Virgin Most Powerful Radio. It's an easy way to do it. I want to thank you for it. Call 855-500-7433. God love you and your family. buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Michuta. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And we are back talking about Gary's incredible new book, Revolt Against Reality. Again, people wondering where you can get the book. Shop.catholic.com. Get a hold of your copy right now. But we're talking about an incredible particular portion of your book. And, you know, we've had a great time talking so far, Gary, but every time we get right into a really good detail, the break does sneak up upon us. So I do want to continue exactly where we left off. We're talking about the particular portion of the book called Epistemological Revolt.
Yes. Yeah, and these religious wars break out because Protestantism begins to shatter into a million pieces. And again, that's that part of nominalism. It keeps breaking things down into individuals, right? So efforts were made to try to figure out how we can reunite all this stuff without going back to the Catholic Church or, the incarnation. And one way was through deism. Deism thought that essentially religion could be reduced to propositions. And so if you just limit the propositions, you reduce it down to a few, then everybody could sign on and we'd all be united. Not only Christians, but also Jews, Hindus, everybody. So, belief in the supreme deity, that there's punishment for bad living and reward in the next life for good living, things like that. And, of course, that just makes God into this, he kind of winds up creation and lets it go. And there's no public revelation. You just have to assent to these propositions. Well, another thing, too, and this was developed especially through John Locke, is that he invents this idea of religion. Now, up to this point, religion was considered a virtue under the subheading of justice. Yeah. So in the ancient world, and even the medieval world, fulfilling what we would call a secular job could be an act of religion. Just like sacrificing could be an act of religion, because religion was a virtue, a duty. And but during the Enlightenment, there was this idea that religion could be separated from the secular sphere, and so the things of faith, all the interior beliefs about God, all dogmas, doctrines, and everything, that could be safely packed away in a kind of safe zone. For religious people to play around with, but everything else, government, property, things like life, liberty, that's secular, and that can be handled outside of any particular religion. And what it does is it creates this category, this bifurcation that actually we kind of see a little bit with Luther's two kingdoms. Yep. And that's where we get to where we are today. And the thing is that Locke's division between church and state, between secular and religious, was a really arbitrary line because, for example, he would place life in the secular sphere, but what is life? When does life begin? What's the value of human life? Can life be justly taken away? Those are all philosophical and religious questions. They're not secular questions. So what happens from then on, from the Enlightenment, is this secular sphere starts encroaching more and more on the so-called religious sphere that they kind of invented. And that you can see that already with today, where people see this as like two completely different universes, where religion is purely interior, it's subjective, it's doesn't have any outward aspects to it. It's purely spiritual, while everything else is the secular sphere. And unfortunately, a lot of Catholics kind of think that way too.
And I think that great point that you bring up there. And in my opinion, their idea of what spiritual is totally opposed to what the Bible actually puts it down as. Because if we are to be spiritual, we would be affiliated with the Apostolic Church, the true church, the Catholic Church that was founded by Christ. But the problem is, Gary, these people in the modern day, they don't want to be associated with, any of these religions. They are spiritual. They believe that their personal relationship and their own walk with Christ, despite them not following any of what the New Testament lays down as being, as what particularly what Paul calls the law of Christ, despite them not following that, it really does open up the door to many other problems. And I appreciate how in your incredible book, you show that this is a reality that we're living in. Not everything is roses and rainbows. There is, unfortunately, we're living through really tough times. And you masterfully in your book, you lay out how from the beginning, throughout history, there have been periods of darkness, periods of light as well, where great champions have risen up to defend the faith. And then it does bring me to the final portion of your incredible book, which is called Social Revolt. And again, I want to plug it in a little bit more because I know people sometimes tune in late. It is Revolt Against Reality. Grab Gary's new book, shop.catholic.com. But I really appreciated how when we began the show, Gary, you point out how you're writing the book and you realize, okay, well, I've got to add to it. I've got to really show that where do I think this is going? Is there going to be, light from so much darkness that we are currently entrenched in? And really, what can the audience expect to find in this particular section of your book?
Yeah, thank you so much for not asking any particulars, because that's the hardest part. It's almost like once you hit the late 1800s, 1900s, it's almost like suddenly this thing spiders into all sorts of strange, incoherent things, and it even affects Catholicism in some very serious ways. And William, so this is by far the most controversial part of my book, and it's also the hardest to write just because I want to cover everything, but you can't, so you have to pick out stuff. Protestantism, there's this idea of conversionism that happens in the early 1800s, where if you have a conversion experience, that's how you know you're elect. And that starts the Second Great Awakening, this huge explosion of excitement in America. Protestants also come face to face with all the divisions. That's when we start getting all the strange mind science things coming out, the Adventism, Mormonism, Millerites. All of that comes from this denial of the external world, where religion really becomes so interior that the conversions say when you get to the 1900s, it's like it doesn't matter which church you belong to. What matters is that you have this conversion experience. You accept Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, and that's it, right? Yeah. So Christianity gets reduced down to an idea once we come to the 1900s, and what happens from that is, I don't want to go into too much detail, but ultimately, I think Vatican II has a big hand in this in a way that I don't think any Catholic approach that. I've never seen a Catholic make this connection. But in a sense, Vatican II kind of pulls the carpet out of what's left of Protestantism. Yeah. In that we used to joke, William, I know you've joked about how the one thing that unifies all Protestants is their opposition to the Pope, right? The opposition to Catholicism.
Correct.
And then you have Vatican II come on, which is, a very pastoral council. Pope Paul VI certainly isn't like one of the popes of the past. And now Protestantism doesn't have a unifying factor, The great giant, this righteous rebel and doctrinal purity no longer has a great foe. And what I believe happens is there's a transition. The righteous rebel and the search for doctrinal purity becomes the righteous social rebel in search of social purity. So now it's like the so-called secular sphere is becoming encountered with nominalism. Okay, so all of, especially in America here, And the effects of nominalism breaks down, dialogue. It breaks down, things. And I mean, and that brings us to things like gender identity stuff, that it's really my will that determines whether I'm a male or female, or, things like that. So I chronicle how marriage breaks down, how we can be confused who we are and what we are. That's all in that last chapter. Like I said, it's very dense.
No doubt about that, Gary. But I think that the one thing that people are going to really appreciate from the book is that you don't shy away from anything controversial. You don't.
This is very unlike anything I've written. Yeah.
Right. You tackle it head on. You really, really do tackle it head on. And I think it really is important in the current climate of the world and the time that we're living in. Is important. And I really appreciate it. And I have to tell you, I had never looked at Vatican II in that particular way as well. But that is a great, great point that you bring out there, Gary. And another thing that you do point out is how the modern familial model, it's under attack, really. And if we think of all of this, Gary, you go right back to the beginning and right there in the garden where the serpent, as you point out masterfully for the audience, I was blown away at how Gary shows how that serpent in the book of Genesis, without a shadow of a doubt, is the devil. That is confirmed for us in Wisdom chapter 2, where it identifies that serpent as the devil. So the devil has been attacking the faithful, and this was prophesied right there in Genesis. And throughout history, we see how this serpent has continued the attacks on the faithful all the way up to the present day. And the familial model, the model of the family, the Christian family, is under attack as well. And I appreciate how you point that out in the book. And, I realize we're coming down to the final few minutes of the show, I think maybe a minute and a half or 2 minutes. But if there is one message, and I know this is very, very simple for an incredibly meaty and theological book like this, if there's one message you would want people to get out from this incredible book of yours, Gary, what would that message be?
Yeah, William, I think that we're spending too much time attacking some of the results of the revolt against reality instead of attacking the primary source of against reality. And so that's what my book's really about, is to try to call people to start thinking about, ways in which we can reestablish this connection between God and His will, that His Word is wisdom, and most especially that we can know reality and live in reality and get rid of all this fantasy and sin.
Incredible. Shop.catholic.com. Revolt Against Reality. Gary, I had a great time, brother. Look forward to being back with you.
William, great job. I got a fear for my job. So thanks a lot. No. And so I need to do the handoff because the fun continues with the Terry and Jesse show coming up next. High Impact Catholic Talk. Thank you so much for listening. God willing, we'll be back again next week. Do this thing we call Hands On. Bye-bye, everybody.